All right, we are talking about the digestive system this week, and I apologize, I'm getting laryngitis a little bit, but that's all right. We're going to get through this. So, we covered a lot of the digestive system last week in lab, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about all of the organs and stuff like that, but we do have some other stuff to touch on this week with the digestive system. So, really quickly, these are just some basic things that the digestive system has. It is continually working in some capacity to move food or beverages through the gastrointestinal system. You don't have to think about digestion. It's just going to happen whether or not we're thinking about it. So it's part of that automatic division of the nervous system. And it's going to be really, really good at taking out what we need from the things that we consume and then getting rid of anything else. And this is all really important to keep us going ultimately because we need nutrients, we need that energy and stuff like that. So, section 2, organs of the digestive system. We're going to look a little bit more in detail about some of these, but we're not going to go over a lot of the actual names of organs and their particular regions and stuff like that, since we've already discussed that in lab. So, digestive system functions are to obviously take in food and drinks, break them down, release the nutrients, absorb those nutrients, and then get rid of anything else that we do not need from those particular products. So, the digestive system is also called the alimentary canal. This is a big long tube essentially going from mouth to anus, and it's got a few different names: alimentary canal, digestive tract, digestive system, and gastrointestinal or GI tract. In addition to the organs making up this tube, there are some accessory organs. So these are not part of that tube, but are still really, really essential to the process of digestion. So we've gone over all of this already in lab, from the salivary glands, the different parts of the pharynx, mouth, different tonsils and stuff like that. We also covered with lab material, and then the main organs making up the digestive system and specific parts of each of those organs. And so digestive system is going to have to work with a bunch of other body systems in order to function optimally, including cardiovascular, endocrine, lymphatic, nervous system, so on and so forth. And so I don't want to go into a ton of detail here, but you can probably figure out pretty quickly how all of these different systems need to really work together in order to have the body functioning optimally. So we need that blood supply because the actual organs themselves need to be able to get nutrients and oxygen, but we also need to get all of those freshly broken down nutrients into the bloodstream so that they can be distributed elsewhere. There's certain endocrine hormones that are going to be really important for digestion. Some of these are really important for nutrient absorption, like the kidneys, and then the skin. So, really needing that vitamin D to get calcium into that skeletal system, which is going to offer some of that protection, along with the muscular system. Obviously, the nervous system has to play a role, so on and so forth. So, the main components of that alimentary canal are the mouth, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, and then small and large intestine. And so, those are the main components. These are the organs that are forming that tube. And then our accessory structures are teeth, tongue, salivary glands, and then the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. All of these are really important to digestion, but they are not actually forming that tube. So, we're going to look at some histology of the alimentary canal. And so, the entire tube is going to have different layers. And these are the mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, and serosa. from the most inner layer of the mucosa out to the serosa, which is the outermost layer. And so this is just kind of a representation of what that can look like. Some organs are going to have some slightly different structures to some of these layers and stuff, but we'll get into that later. So that mucosa on the very inside, surrounding the actual opening, which is called the lumen, that is made up of the epithelial tissue, the lamina propria, which is connective tissue, and then some muscularis mucosa, so a mucous membrane. Surrounding that is the submucosa. So that's this layer right here. You can see this is where we're getting a lot of glands being kind of initially housed that are then going to travel through the mucosa to the lumen. We also get a lot of our blood vessels and nerve connections in this particular layer. Then we have the muscularis layer. This is usually going to be anywhere from 1 to 3 layers of muscles. So in this particular view, we're seeing 2 layers, a circular muscle, and then a longitudinal muscle. So the circular muscle is going to wrap around in a circle, and then the longitudinal muscle, the fibers are going to run parallel to the tube. So the muscle fibers in each layer are running in different directions. The stomach has an additional layer to this. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then the serosa, that most outer layer, is going to have areolar connective tissue and more epithelium covering it. And then kind of fused to that serosa layer is going to be some of our mesenteries. So the mucosa is made up again of that epithelium, lamina propria, and muscularis mucosa. So the epithelia in the mucosa is non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelial. This is mostly found in the mouth, pharynx, esophagus, and anal canal. And then in the stomach and intestines, we are going to have simple columnar epithelial cells instead of the stratified squamous. And that's just because we need slightly different structures there. And this is also going to include some goblet cells that secrete mucus, and then some enteroendocrine cells that are going to secrete hormones. The lamina propria is loose connective tissue along with those blood and lymphatic vessels. This is also where we would find that malt tissue that we talked about with the lymphatic system last week, the mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, and specifically Peyer's patches in the ileum of the small intestine. And this is a really important part of the lymphatic and immune system. The muscularis mucosa, this is a very, very thin layer of smooth muscle. There's always going to be tension on this, and then it's going to actually be what creates the folds in the lining of the stomach and the small intestine, so those rugae and then the circular folds that we learned about in the lab last week. It's going to have a very, very large surface area, making it very, very good for secretion and absorption of different substances. And then the submucosa, this is going to be much, much deeper. This is dense, irregular connective tissue. There's also going to be some blood and lymphatic vessels found in this layer, but it's also going to have a lot more of the submucosal glands that secrete a lot of digestive enzymes. And then it also possesses what's called the submucosal plexus, which is a big branching network of nerves whose job it is to stimulate the muscularis mucosa layer. So this thin, smooth muscle layer right here. So we need nerves to actually be stimulating that. The muscularis externa, these are going to be additional layers of smooth muscle. They're going to be a lot thicker than that muscularis mucosa layer, which is a very, very thin layer of muscle. So this muscularis externa is much, much thicker layers, but still of smooth muscle, right? And so the only places we're not going to find the 2 layers here, the inner circular layer and outer longitudinal layer, are going to be the mouth, pharynx, upper esophagus, and then the external anal sphincter. Those are all going to have skeletal muscle rather than just smooth muscle. Another exception, like I mentioned earlier, is that the stomach has an additional third layer of muscle. This is going to be oblique. We'll see a picture of that a little bit later. And then another exception is the large intestine. This is going to have 3 bands of longitudinal smooth muscle, and that's what's forming those Taenia coli that we learned about in lab. And then that outermost layer can vary a little bit. So serosa, if it's inside of the abdominal cavity specifically, this is going to be the stomach and intestines. This is also known as the visceral peritoneum, and it's going to go over some loose connective tissue, and this is continuous with all of the mesenteries. Outside of the abdominal cavity, that outermost layer is the adventitia. This is going to be found in the mouth, pharynx, and esophagus. So nerve supply is really important to the digestive system. Obviously, we need to be continuously moving that through, and we actually have a couple different ways of having that innervation within the digestive system. So we have both intrinsic and extrinsic innervation. So intrinsic is something called the enteric nervous system. And this is actually a division of our automatic nervous system or autonomic nervous system that is specific to the digestive system itself. So the enteric nervous system is not going to be found anywhere else or control anything outside of the digestive system. And we've got 2 plexuses that are forming that enteric system in the submucosa. That is the plexus of Meissner or submucosal plexa, and then the myenteric plexus or plexus of Auerbach. And so this is going to be found closer to the muscular layer, whereas this submucosal layer is obviously going to be in that submucosis. And then the extrinsic innervation is still part of that autonomic nervous system. Autonomic means automatic, and its job is communication with that enteric nervous system. And so the autonomic nervous system, and we'll go over this in more detail at the end of the semester when we cover the nervous system, but this automatic division is going to have 2 branches, the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic is what controls our fight or flight response, and then parasympathetic controls what we typically refer to as the rest and digest response. So this is where homeostasis is occurring, is with that parasympathetic nervous system being fully in control of what's going on. So the sympathetic nervous system, if it's activated during that fight or flight response, it's going to restrict some of that nervous system activity to the digestive system. So it's going to limit the enteric nervous system activity so that there is less digestion happening, because if you're running or fighting for your life, you don't really need to be actually digesting food. You need that blood supply going elsewhere to your muscles and heart and stuff like that. The parasympathetic, because this is our rest and digest response, this is going to increase activity in the enteric division and lead to more digestive system activity. Blood supply, obviously really important. We have a bunch of branches off of the aortic arch and thoracic aorta going to the upper portion of the GI system, and then the celiac trunk off of the abdominal aorta, taking oxygenated blood to stomach, liver, and duodenum. Then we've got those superior and inferior mesenteric arteries for the rest of the GI tract, as well as that left gastric artery that we covered in lab, that's going to go to the stomach as well. That's branching off that celiac trunk. And then those mesenteric arteries are going to most of the intestines. And then for all of these, we've got corresponding veins carrying blood that is Oxygen depleted, but very rich in absorbed nutrients from the GI tract and spleen to the liver via that hepatic portal vein. And so the liver is going to take out some of those nutrients as well as any potential toxins and waste products that it's capable of dealing with. All right, the peritoneum we've talked a little bit about. This is a really broad serous membrane that's forming a sac, and its job is to hold all of those digestive organs in place, and it has two layers. The parietal peritoneum is the lining within the abdominal cavity, but it's going to be the more superficial layer. And then the visceral peritoneum is lining the actual surface of the abdominal organs. Again, this is also known as the serosa, so that outermost layer. And this is also going to become the mesenteries and folds, forming some double layers with the vessels and nerves that we saw with like the mesentery proper and stuff like that. So these are the 5 major peritoneal folds. We've learned most of these in lab, but not all of them because they're not all visible on models and stuff. So the greater omentum, that apron-like structure lying over the small intestine and transverse colon. Falciform ligament is going to help anchor that liver again to the abdominal wall. And the diaphragm, lesser omentum, helps suspend the stomach from the inferior border of the liver. Mesentery proper is going to help anchor all of the small intestine except for that duodenum. And then there's also a mesocolon, which we did not cover in lab. And this is going to attach a couple portions of the large intestine, transverse and sigmoid colon, to the posterior side of the abdominal wall. And so this is what that looks like if we were seeing a mid-sagittal view. And so we've got that parietal peritoneum in green, so that outer layer. And so you can kind of see how that's encasing all of these different organs and stuff within the abdominal cavity. Lesser omentum here in yellow, connecting up to the stomach, which is going to be this organ right here. Mesocolon in magenta, that's really hard to see, but it is back here. As well as some over here a little bit. That transverse colon is right there. Greater omentum, we have seen that. That's that apron-like structure right there. Mesentery proper, holding together all of those small intestine. And then again, that visceral peritoneum lining is going to be what's on the surface here. So where all of these different colored structures are, visceral peritoneum in aqua, that is sitting again right on the surface of all of these different organs. Looking at those mesenteries and specifically the omentum here, lesser omentum up here, this is going to be our stomach. Greater omentum is that apron-like connective tissue. Here's the mesocolon. It's going to be sitting there behind the transverse colon, as well as the rest of the sections of the colon. We just can't see most of those. And that is going to wrap up this first video. We will continue talking about some different processes and regulation of digestion in the next video.